Late one night, an overwhelming silence permeated the living room, dissolving every unspoken boundary we believed we had maintained. The evening began ordinarily, just another quiet night in our suburban home, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the hall clock. The stillness felt almost surreal, as if the world held its breath in anticipation. I lay in bed, aimlessly scrolling through my phone, the soft glow illuminating my darkened room. My thoughts drifted, flitting from one subject to another without focus. It was another sleepless night, or so I assumed, but tonight, an undeniable tension hung in the air, a feeling I couldn't shake. Nothing appeared outwardly unusual, yet my instincts buzzed with a strange awareness. A part of me urged me to explore the quiet house, but I remained, convincing myself it was merely my imagination. A soft knock at my door broke the silence. "Come in," I called out, my voice a little too eager, shattering the stillness. The door creaked open, revealing my stepfather. He hesitated momentarily, studying me with an unreadable expression. "Hey," he said, entering with a cautious smile, "you're still awake." "Yeah," I shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "Couldn't sleep." He nodded knowingly. "I get it. One of those nights, huh?" He sat on the edge of my bed, and a nervous flutter stirred in my stomach. We'd always been close, but a subtle shift had occurred recently. I couldn't pinpoint it, but there was a difference in his gaze, the way he lingered a moment too long, just like now. "Is everything okay?" I asked, hoping to dispel the silence. He glanced down, almost embarrassed, then met my eyes with a faint smile. "Yeah, of course. Just checking on you. Wanted to make sure you were all right." His voice was soft, gentle, making me feel strangely exposed. It felt as though he could see through my carefully constructed defenses. "Thanks," I mumbled, looking away, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. "I'm fine. Just restless, I guess." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. His touch was warm, grounding, and for a moment, a sense of calm washed over me. But then he hesitated, his hand lingering, and the calm morphed into something else, something I couldn't decipher. A beat of silence passed, and I realized I was holding my breath, anticipating his next words. He remained silent, his expression inscrutable, as if debating his next move. The air crackled with unspoken tension, a sense of standing on the edge of the unknown. "Listen, he began, then stopped, shaking his head with a small, awkward laugh. "Sorry. I didn't mean to make this weird. I just wanted to make sure you were okay." He stood, his eyes lingering, searching, as if hoping I'd offer a reason for him to stay. My mind raced, a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions I couldn't process. I wanted to ask him to stay, to confess my need for someone to talk to, but the words caught in my throat. I simply nodded, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Good night," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Without another word, he turned and left, leaving me alone with my racing heart and a multitude of unanswered questions. But this wasn't the end. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the memory of that moment. His gaze, the gentle touch of his hand. It replayed in my mind, a constant loop I couldn't escape. I wondered if I was imagining things, reading too much into a simple gesture of concern. He was my stepfather. He cared. That was normal, wasn't it? But every time I tried to dismiss it, something would happen. A lingering glance, a touch that felt too intimate, a silence that stretched a beat too long. An invisible thread seemed to connect us, drawing us closer despite our unspoken hesitations. One night I found myself alone with him in the kitchen. Everyone else had retired, and we were cleaning up after a late-night snack. The dishwasher hummed softly, and the overhead light cast long shadows across the floor. The atmosphere felt strangely intimate, the two of us standing side by side in the empty kitchen. I glanced at him, catching his eye just as he looked up. Something in his gaze made my heart skip a beat, a softness, a warmth I hadn't noticed before. For a fleeting moment, time seemed to stop, as if we were the only two people in existence. He must have sensed it too, because he cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. "So," he began, a little too casually, "how's everything going? I know things have been different lately." I looked down, trying to gather my thoughts. "Yeah, I guess they have," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "But it's not bad, just different." He nodded thoughtfully. "You know, you can talk to me about anything. I'm here for you. Always." His words were meant to comfort, but an unspoken tension lingered between us. I felt my cheeks flush, and I quickly averted my gaze. He noticed. Gently, he tilted my chin up, forcing me to meet his soft, understanding eyes. "Hey," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. "You don't have to hide anything from me. I'm here for you, okay?" I nodded, swallowing hard, my heart pounding. "I know, thanks." He smiled, that same gentle, reassuring smile that usually eased my anxieties. But this time, there was something more in his gaze, a depth, a warmth that made me feel both safe and vulnerable. It felt as though he was seeing a hidden part of myself, a part I wasn't sure I wanted him to see. The moment stretched, the silence thick with unspoken words. I wanted to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. I just stood there, enveloped by the quiet, feeling the strange, unexplainable connection that had formed between us. Just as quickly as it began, the moment passed. He released my chin and stepped back with a small, awkward smile. "I should probably get to bed," he said, his voice light, almost casual. "Early morning tomorrow." "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely audible. "Good night." He hesitated, as if wanting to say more, then simply nodded and left the room. I was left alone with my racing thoughts and a heart that felt like it might explode. As I stood there in the empty kitchen, I realized nothing would ever be the same. For days after that quiet kitchen encounter, I couldn't shake the feeling that things had shifted between us. I replayed his look, the softness in his eyes that left me both flustered and unsettled. I tried to dismiss it as a simple misunderstanding, but deep down, I knew better. I felt it in the way he lingered whenever we were near, in the way his gaze would flicker towards me, even when he thought I wasn't looking. I told myself I was overthinking, that it was all in my head. But each day, the simmering tension between us became harder to deny. I could sense it whenever he was close, a palpable weight in the air neither of us acknowledged. Every glance, every casual brush of his hand against mine, seemed charged with unspoken meaning, a silent invitation I was too afraid to accept. One evening, I decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. I needed to get away, to create some distance between us, even if only temporarily. But as I opened the front door, I heard his voice behind me. "Going somewhere?" I turned to find him leaning against the doorframe, wearing his usual casual smile. But this time, there was something else in his eyes, something that made my stomach twist. "Just going for a walk," I replied, trying to maintain a steady voice. He nodded, pushing himself away from the doorframe. "Mind if I join you?" For a moment, I considered refusing, but before I could speak, he was already putting on his jacket and stepping outside beside me. His presence was warm and solid in the cool night air. We walked in silence, our footsteps echoing softly on the empty street. I kept my eyes down, trying to ignore the way my pulse quickened whenever he glanced at me. I wanted to speak, to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. The tension between us had taken on a life of its own, filling the space with an unspoken intensity neither of us could escape. Finally, he broke the silence. "You've seemed different lately," he said, his voice low and cautious. "Is everything okay?" I hesitated, unsure how to respond. How could I explain the confusion and unease churning inside me? How could I tell him I felt like I was standing on the edge of something I didn't understand? Something that both scared and intrigued me. "I'm fine," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just a lot on my mind, I guess." He nodded, his gaze lingering on me before he looked away. "I get that," he said softly. "Sometimes it feels like everything's changing, doesn't it?" His words struck a chord, resonating with the turmoil within me. I looked up, searching his face for some clue to his thoughts, but his expression remained calm and unreadable, giving nothing away. "Yeah," I murmured, my voice barely a whisper. "It does." We continued walking, our footsteps falling into a steady rhythm, the silence heavy with unspoken words. I felt the weight of his gaze, the subtle tension in the air, but I forced myself to look ahead, ignoring the fluttering in my chest. I told myself it was just my imagination, that there was nothing unusual about any of this. But a part of me knew that was a lie. As we reached the edge of the neighborhood, he stopped, turning to face me. "Do you ever feel like you don't quite belong?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. There was a vulnerability in his tone that made my heart ache with an intensity I couldn't understand. I nodded, unsure how else to respond. It was as if he'd reached inside and pulled out the very thoughts I'd been trying to suppress. For so long, I had felt like an outsider, living someone else's life, playing a role that didn't fit. And now, standing here with him, I felt that same sense of disconnect, that same quiet yearning for something more. "Sometimes," I replied, my voice barely audible, "sometimes I feel like I'm missing something, like there's this emptiness I can't fill." He looked at me, his eyes soft and understanding. "I know what you mean," he said quietly. "It's like no matter what you do, there's always this part of you that's just out of reach." His words hung in the air, heavy and raw. My heart pounded, my pulse raced as I struggled to make sense of the emotions swirling within me. I wanted to reach out, to close the distance between us, but I was too afraid of what that might mean, of what it might reveal. We stood there for a long moment, neither of us speaking, letting the silence fill the space between us. It was as if we were both waiting for some unspoken signal, permission to take that final step. But neither of us moved, caught in the tension that both pulled us closer and held us apart. Finally, he sighed softly, breaking the silence. "I guess we should head back," he murmured, his voice barely audible. I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak. As we walked back, the tension intensified, an invisible force pulling at my heart, leaving me both exhilarated and terrified. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that we had crossed an invisible line, a point of no return. Back at the house, he paused in the doorway, glancing back at me with a look that made my heart skip a beat. "Good night," he said, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "Good night," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. He lingered for a moment, his eyes searching mine, as if trying to decipher the thoughts I was too afraid to voice. Then, with a small nod, he turned and disappeared down the hall, leaving me alone with the silence and the racing of my own heart. But the story didn't end there. In fact, it was only just beginning. In the days that followed, the tension between us intensified, growing stronger with every shared glance, every casual touch that lingered a moment too long. I could feel the pull, the quiet, unspoken connection that bound us together, even as we both tried to ignore it. We were caught in a dance, each step bringing us closer to a line we knew we shouldn't cross, yet couldn't resist. One evening, I found myself alone in the living room, flipping through TV channels, trying to distract myself from the thoughts that haunted me. I was barely paying attention to the screen when he entered the room. I glanced up, my heart skipping a beat as he sat beside me, his presence warm and familiar. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice low and calm, though an edge to it made my pulse quicken. "Of course not," I replied, trying to sound casual despite my racing heart. We sat in silence, the flickering TV casting shadows across the room. The tension between us was thick, electric, filling the space with a thrilling and terrifying intensity. I wanted to speak, to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. We were both waiting, caught in a moment that felt both inevitable and impossible. After a while, he shifted, leaning closer, his arm brushing against mine. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a shiver down my spine, leaving me breathless and dizzy. I glanced at him, catching a flicker in his eyes that made my heart race even faster. He didn't speak, didn't move, just held my gaze with a quiet intensity that left me feeling both exposed and exhilarated. My pulse pounded in my ears, my mind raced as I tried to make sense of the swirling emotions. It felt as if everything we had held back, everything we had been too afraid to acknowledge, was finally coming to the surface. I wanted to speak, to ask him what he was thinking, but the words caught in my throat. All I could do was sit there, trapped in the quiet, electric tension, feeling the pull between us grow stronger with each passing second. As the silence stretched on, I realized there was no turning back. We were on the precipice of something neither of us fully understood, something both terrifying and thrilling, but one thing was certain. Whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same. I couldn't avoid him forever. Every encounter, every accidental brush of hands, every lingering glance tightened the web we were both caught in. No matter how hard I tried to pull away, I was drawn deeper into something I couldn't understand, something neither of us could resist. It was another late night, the house silent and dim, when I found myself alone with him again. This time in the living room. The low lights cast soft shadows, and the quiet hum of the evening made everything feel slower, as if time itself had slowed down just for us. My pulse quickened as he entered, casually sitting beside me on the couch, so close that his presence alone seemed to thicken the air. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, breaking the silence without disturbing it. I nodded, unable to speak. The words felt too heavy, too dangerous. I knew that voicing them would shatter the fragile control we had left. Instead, I looked down, fidgeting with my shirt, acutely aware of his lingering gaze, soft yet intense, like he was seeing a part of me no one else could. "Me neither. Me neither," he murmured, leaning back, his arm draped casually across the back of the couch. I felt the brush of his fingers against my shoulder, a gentle, almost accidental touch that made my heart race. Every inch between us felt charged, the air buzzing with the tension neither of us dared to acknowledge. I turned to look at him, catching the way his eyes softened as they met mine. There was something there, something raw and unguarded, and for a moment it felt like we were both stripped bare, our secrets laid out between us, unspoken but undeniable. He didn't look away, didn't hide how he felt, and I realized he was just as caught up in this as I was. Slowly, he leaned closer, his face inches from mine. I could feel his warm breath against my skin, and my heart hammered in my chest, every nerve alive with anticipation and fear. I wanted to move, to pull away, but I was frozen, captured by the intensity of the moment, by his gaze. Neither of us spoke. The silence was thick, almost suffocating, yet it was the only thing keeping us grounded, preventing us from falling over the edge. I could feel my resolve slipping, the quiet, insistent pull between us drawing me closer, making it impossible to think, impossible to resist. Then, before I knew what was happening, his hand moved, his fingers brushing softly against my cheek. The touch was light, almost hesitant, as if testing the waters, waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. My heart pounded, and I leaned into his touch, feeling the warmth of his skin against mine, grounding me, calming the storm of emotions raging inside. His thumb traced gently along my jawline, his gaze never leaving mine. There was a question in his eyes, a silent request, and I knew that whatever happened next was up to me. For a fleeting moment, I considered pulling away, breaking the spell. But the thought vanished, replaced by a quiet, insistent need I couldn't ignore. Before I could second-guess myself, I closed the distance, letting my lips brush against his in a soft, tentative kiss. It was a gentle touch, but the effect was immediate, a spark igniting between us, leaving me breathless and dizzy. His hand slipped to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, deepening the kiss. I melted into him, letting go of the fear, the uncertainty, the doubts that had held me back for so long. His lips were warm and soft, and as the kiss deepened, I felt a rush of indescribable emotions. It was as if everything I had held back, everything I had been too afraid to face, was finally set free. In that moment, there was nothing else in the world but the two of us, wrapped in each other's warmth, lost in a connection that went beyond words. We pulled apart, breathless, our faces inches apart. I could see the same mix of emotions reflected in his eyes: fear, desire, confusion, and something deeper, something that made my heart ache in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. He didn't speak, didn't break the silence. Instead, he reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine, grounding me, anchoring me in a moment that felt both impossibly real and like a dream. I could feel the steady beat of his heart against my palm, a silent reassurance that I wasn't alone in this, that whatever this was, we were in it together. His pulse throbbed beneath my fingers, a silent reassurance that I wasn't alone, that he felt it too. For a long, suspended moment we remained motionless, allowing the silence to speak volumes, letting the weight of the recent events descend upon us. It was as though any sudden movement would fracture the delicate connection we'd forged, leaving us adrift in an ocean of unanswered questions and nagging doubts. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice hushed and raw. "Are you okay?" I nodded, swallowing the tightness in my throat, a knot formed by a torrent of emotions I couldn't unravel. "Yeah," I whispered, my voice barely a breath. I think I am." He gently squeezed my hand, his eyes locked on mine. "Good," he murmured, his voice a calming presence in the quiet. I want you to know that you don't have to go through this alone. Whatever this is, we're in it together." His words brought a wave of tranquility, a soothing balm to the inner turmoil. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, I felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging I'd never experienced. I knew that whatever lay ahead, whatever trials we might encounter, we would face them together, shoulder to shoulder. We stayed like that for a long while, hands intertwined, our breaths mingling in the hushed intimacy of the moment. The outside world seemed to dissolve, leaving only the two of us enveloped in a bond that transcended words, reason, anything I'd ever known. As the night deepened and the world slipped into darkness, a quiet, steady warmth bloomed within my chest, assuring me that somehow everything would be all right. But I knew this was just the beginning. There were still questions that needed answers, anxieties to confront. As much as I longed to cling to this moment, I understood that we couldn't remain hidden forever. Sooner or later, we would have to step back into the light and face whatever awaited us beyond the safety of these walls. For now, though, I surrendered to the moment, sinking into the warmth of his presence, losing myself in the quiet, unspoken connection that bound us. It was a fragile, delicate thread, this bond we'd woven, yet in that moment it felt like the strongest, most beautiful thing in the world. His arm encircled me, drawing me closer, and I rested my head against his shoulder, exhaling a soft sigh of contentment. There were no words, no explanations, just the silent understanding that we were both exactly where we needed to be. And in that silence, in that perfect, hushed moment, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever trials we would face them together. In the following days, everything felt different. I went through my routines as if nothing had changed, yet there was an underlying awareness, a quiet hum that resonated between us. We spoke less, but every glance, every touch, carried a weight that words couldn't express. It was as if we were both silently trying to decipher what had transpired and what it signified. Each of us too apprehensive to voice our thoughts, too afraid to shatter the fragile bond we'd created. At home, we maintained a careful distance, our conversations light and almost formal, as if neither of us dared to venture too close. But every time I caught his gaze, a part of me ached with the memory of that night, of the intimacy we'd shared, of the quiet solace of his presence. I knew things couldn't revert to the way they were, that whatever boundaries we'd crossed had irrevocably altered everything. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more, that we had only just begun to understand the connection that drew us together. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across the living room, he entered and sat beside me. We didn't speak, just sat there in the fading light, the silence comfortable, like we had settled into a new understanding. I could feel his gaze upon me, soft and warm, and I resisted the urge to reach out, to bridge the distance that still lingered between us. After a time, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what this is," he admitted, his tone gentle and cautious, "but I can't pretend it didn't happen." I looked at him, my heart pounding as I searched for the words to articulate what I felt. But nothing seemed adequate. Nothing felt potent enough to capture the maelstrom of emotions churning within me. Instead, I simply nodded, letting him know I understood, that I felt it too. "We can't just ignore it," he continued, his gaze intense, searching my eyes for some sign, some indication of what I was thinking. "I don't want to complicate things for you, but I can't pretend it didn't mean anything." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of all that remained unspoken. I felt the lump form in my throat, my emotions tangled and raw. For a moment, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I felt like I was standing on the precipice of something vast and unknown, something that both terrified and exhilarated me. "I don't know what this is either," I confessed, my voice barely audible, "but I know it's not something I want to lose." A flicker of relief crossed his face and he reached out, his hand settling gently on mine. His touch was warm and grounding, and in that moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. I looked at him. I looked down at our intertwined hands, his fingers laced through mine, and a quiet strength, A tranquility I hadn't experienced in ages washed over me. We sat in silence, letting the weight of our connection settle upon us, knowing that whatever came next, we would confront it together. Lingering questions and anxieties still danced at the edges of my mind, but in that moment, they held no significance. All that mattered was the silent, unspoken bond that had united us, emboldening us to step beyond boundaries we once believed impenetrable. As the weeks passed, we established a quiet, unspoken rhythm, a mutual understanding that transcended words. Moments of uncertainty still arose, nights when I lay awake pondering the future, but in the daylight, with him by my side, my anxieties dissipated, replaced by a sense of peace and belonging I had never known. But the world, as it always does, has a way of complicating even the simplest things. One evening, as we sat together, absorbed in a comfortable silence, the familiar sound of approaching footsteps echoed in the hallway, followed by a gentle knock at the door. My heart leaped, my pulse racing as I realized we were no longer alone. "Hey, you guys in here?" A cheerful, familiar voice called. For a brief, terrifying moment, panic surged through me. He looked at me, eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and apprehension, mirroring the fear I felt. We had been so cautious, so vigilant in concealing our connection, and now, in an instant, it felt as though everything was unraveling. The door opened, revealing her smiling face, her gaze shifting between us with a curious expression. I forced myself to remain composed, to feign normalcy, even as my heart hammered in my chest. We exchanged pleasantries, engaging in small talk as if nothing was amiss, as if we were merely two individuals sharing a quiet moment on an ordinary evening. But beneath the surface, tension simmered, the weight of our shared secret a suffocating pressure. I glanced at him, catching the flicker of worry in his eyes, knowing he felt it too, understood the precariousness of our situation, the delicate balance we had to maintain. As the conversation progressed, I experienced a strange blend of relief and regret, a part of me yearning for the simplicity of a life unburdened by secrets. But I knew that was an impossibility. We had crossed a threshold, ventured into uncharted territory, and now we had to live with the repercussions, bear the weight of our choices in silence. When she finally departed, the door closing softly behind her, I released a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. He reached out, his hand resting on my shoulder, a silent reassurance of his presence, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this. "We're going to be okay," he murmured, his voice steady and comforting. I nodded, my heart still racing, but his words instilled a sense of calm, a quiet strength that helped me overcome the fear and uncertainty. I knew there would be obstacles ahead, that we would have to tread carefully, that the path we had chosen was far from easy. But in that moment, gazing into his eyes, I knew it was worth it, that whatever hardships we might encounter, we would face them together, and in the end, that was all that mattered. As days bled into weeks, we learned to navigate the intricacies of our connection, discovering ways to be together without attracting undue attention, creating a sanctuary where we could be ourselves without fear. Doubts still lingered. Nights when I lay awake questioning our choices, wondering if we were risking too much. But whenever those doubts surfaced, he was there, steadfast and unwavering, his presence a quiet reassurance that I wasn't alone, that we were in this together. One night, as we sat together in the fading light, he looked at me, his gaze soft and unguarded. "No matter what happens," he whispered, his voice a quiet promise, "we'll find a way. We always do." I smiled, a warmth blossoming in my chest, a quiet, steady confidence that quelled all my fears. In that moment, I knew that whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges we might face, we would face them side by side, together. And as the world around us continued to turn, as days melted into nights and seasons changed, we found a kind of peace, a quiet, unspoken happiness that made all the struggles, all the sacrifices, worthwhile. It wasn't always easy, and moments of doubt still arose, nights when I pondered the future. But as long as he was there, as long as we had each other, I knew we could overcome anything. And perhaps, in the end, that was all we needed.